let's get something clear from the start, because this is where most people misunderstand avoidant individuals. When someone has an avoidant attachment style, they don't experience love as a simple, I like you, so I stay close. For them, closeness can feel like pressure, vulnerability can feel like risk, and emotional dependence can feel like loss of control. But here's the twist most people miss. Just because some pulls away doesn't mean they don't feel deeply. In fact, sometimes the people who seem the most distant are the ones feeling the most. So let's break down the 5 real psychological signs that an avoidant is actually in love with you even while they're running from it. Avoidant attachment doesn't mean a lack of love. It often means a deep fear of emotional dependence that gets mistaken for disinterest. On the surface, an avoidant person can seem distant, self-sufficient, or even emotionally unavailable, but underneath that behavior is usually a nervous system that associates closeness with pressure, loss of control, or potential emotional overwhelm. So when intimacy starts to grow, instead of moving naturally toward connection, they may instinctively create space, not because they don't care, but because their internal wiring is trying to restore a sense of safety. For someone with an avoidant pattern, love can feel like something that quietly intensifies pressure. The closer someone gets, the more their system may start scanning for ways to regain independence. This doesn't happen because they value the other person less, but because emotional reliance can feel unfamiliar or even threatening. In many cases, they learned early in life that depending on others leads to disappointment, inconsistency, or emotional discomfort. So as adults, they may equate needing someone with losing themselves. This is why their behavior can feel contradictory. They might genuinely enjoy your presence, feel warmth toward you, and even develop strong attachment, but then suddenly pull back when things become emotionally intense. To the outside world, it looks like mixed signals. Internally, however, it's more like a push and pull between connection and self-protection. One part of them is drawn to closeness, while another part is working hard to prevent emotional vulnerability from going too far. It's also important to understand that avoidant individuals don't always express affection in obvious ways. Instead of verbal reassurance or emotional openness, their care often shows up through actions that maintain a controlled level of intimacy. They may check in on you indirectly, stay consistent in practical support, or reappear after distance as a way of reconnecting without fully exposing their emotional world. These small behaviors often carry more meaning than they appear to on the surface. The key misunderstanding happens when people interpret their distance as a lack of interest. In reality, avoidance is often a strategy to manage emotional intensity, not to reject connection itself. The paradox is that avoidant individuals can feel deeply connected while simultaneously feeling the urge to step back from that same connection. This creates confusion for both sides of the relationship. Ultimately, avoidant attachment is not about an absence of feeling. It's about a fear of what those feelings might demand emotionally. Understanding this doesn't mean tolerating inconsistency without boundaries, but it does help shift the perspective from they don't care to they care, but struggle with closeness. Love from an avoidant person is usually shown through actions, not emotional expression, because emotional openness often feels like the most vulnerable and high-risk form of intimacy for them. While many people naturally express love through words, reassurance, or emotional availability, someone with an avoidant attachment style tends to operate differently. Their internal world is often structured around self-control, emotional independence, and minimizing situations where they feel exposed or dependent on another person. So instead of saying how they feel in a direct or emotionally rich way, they tend to do love rather than say it. You might notice that they show up when it actually matters, even if they are inconsistent in communication. They might help you solve problems, remember practical details about your life, or step in quietly when you need support without turning it into an emotional moment. To them, these actions feel safer than verbal declarations, because actions allow them to maintain emotional distance while still staying connected. This can be confusing for someone who expects love to sound like reassurance, affection, and consistent emotional availability. But in an avoidant dynamic, emotional expression can feel like losing control or becoming too exposed. So instead of saying, I miss you, they might check in on you in a practical way. Instead of talking about feelings, they might fix something, offer help, or stay present in a low-pressure way that doesn't demand emotional intensity. It's important to understand that this doesn't mean their feelings are smaller or less real. In many cases, Avoidant individuals feel deeply but struggle with translating those feelings into words because emotional expression was not safely reinforced in their past. They may have learned that showing too much emotion leads to misunderstanding, rejection, or discomfort. As a result, they develop a preference for communication styles that feel controlled and predictable. Their love often appears in patterns rather than statements. For example, they may consistently return after periods of distance, or they may remain quietly present in your life, even when they seem emotionally detached. These behaviors are not random. They often indicate a level of attachment that they are managing carefully. Staying connected without fully engaging emotionally becomes their way of balancing closeness with safety. However, this form of love can easily be misread. People may assume that if it is not expressed emotionally, it is not strong enough or not genuine. But in reality, for an avoidant person, emotional restraint is often a form of self-protection, not a lack of care. The love exists, but it is filtered through caution. At its core, loving an avoidant person means learning to read consistency, effort, and presence in actions rather than expecting verbal reassurance to carry the full meaning of their attachment. When an avoidant feels deeply, they often don't move in a straight line toward closeness. Instead, they enter what psychologists describe as an approach-withdraw pattern, where they are drawn toward intimacy, connection, and emotional bonding, but then suddenly step back when that same closeness starts to feel overwhelming or too intense. This doesn't mean their feelings are shallow or uncertain. It means their emotional regulation system is constantly trying to balance two competing needs: connection and autonomy. At the beginning of emotional closeness, an avoidant person may actually seem very engaged. They might initiate contact, show interest, or even open up in ways that surprise you. In those early stages, connection feels exciting and manageable because it hasn't yet crossed their internal threshold of emotional intensity. But as the relationship deepens and vulnerability increases, their nervous system may begin to interpret that same closeness as pressure or potential. Loss of independence. This is where the withdrawal phase begins. It can look like sudden distance, reduced communication, emotional shutdown, or a shift into busyness and distraction. From the outside, it may seem like they are losing interest or pulling away without reason. But internally, what's happening is more complex. They are not necessarily disconnecting from their feelings. They are trying to regulate the intensity of those feelings so they don't feel consumed or overwhelmed by them. The key point is that avoidant individuals often don't have a stable emotional middle zone when attachment activates strongly. Instead of staying consistently close and emotionally present, they oscillate between engagement and distance. When the emotional pressure feels manageable, they move toward connection. When it feels too intense, they retreat to regain a sense of control and emotional space. This cycle can be deeply confusing for the partner on the receiving end. It can feel like being pulled in and pushed away repeatedly, creating emotional uncertainty. One moment there is warmth and closeness, and the next there is distance and emotional silence. However, this inconsistency is not always a reflection of changing feelings. It is often a reflection of internal emotional conflict. What makes this pattern particularly important to understand is that the withdrawal phase does not necessarily mean the connection is gone. In many cases, the feelings are still present, but the avoidant person is temporarily prioritizing emotional regulation over relational closeness. After some time and distance, when their system feels calmer again, they may re-enter the connection, restarting the approach phase. This cycle can repeat itself many times unless awareness and communication improve on both sides. The avoidant person is not intentionally creating confusion. Rather, they are navigating closeness with a nervous system that associates sustained emotional intensity with discomfort. Their movement is not random. It is adaptive based on how safe or overwhelmed they feel in the moment. Understanding this pattern doesn't mean excusing inconsistency, but it does help reframe it. Instead of seeing it as simple rejection, it becomes clearer that what looks like emotional push-pull is often an attempt to manage closeness without losing a sense of self. Safety is the key trigger for an avoidant to reveal real attachment because emotional openness for them is not simply about feeling close. It is about feeling safe enough to stay close without losing their sense of control or identity. Unlike someone with an anxious attachment style who may move quickly toward reassurance and emotional expression, an avoidant individual tends to evaluate closeness through an internal safety filter. If the connection feels unpredictable, demanding, or emotionally intense too quickly, their natural response is to pull back. But when the relationship feels stable, respectful, and non-intrusive, something very different can begin to emerge. For an avoidant person, safety is not just physical or external. It is deeply emotional and psychological. It means not feeling pressured to constantly respond, not feeling judged for needing space, and not feeling emotionally engulfed by the expectations of the relationship. When those conditions are present, their nervous system starts to relax. And when the nervous system relaxes, their natural attachment feelings have room to surface without triggering defensive withdrawal. This is why you may notice that avoidant individuals often open up in environments where there is no emotional pressure attached to the interaction. They might share more when the conversation feels casual, or show affection indirectly when they don't feel expected to perform emotionally. The absence of pressure becomes the condition that allows genuine connection to appear. In contrast, when emotional demands increase too quickly, even if they love the person, their system may interpret it as a threat to autonomy and respond with distance. Safety also plays a role in consistency. An avoidant person is far more likely to stay emotionally present when they trust that closeness will not lead to emotional overwhelm or loss of self. This trust is built slowly over time through predictable behavior, respectful boundaries, and a lack of emotional coercion. Once that trust is established, their attachment is not only more visible, it is also more stable. However, it's important to understand that this process is not linear. Even when safety exists, avoidant individuals may still experience moments of withdrawal. But the difference is that they are more likely to return, re-engage, and maintain connection when they feel safe in the relationship overall. Safety does not eliminate their attachment system, it regulates it. In many cases, people misunderstand this dynamic and assume that avoidant individuals only open up when they are uninterested or emotionally detached. In reality, the opposite is often true. The more emotionally safe they feel, the more their genuine attachment can surface. But because their baseline wiring associates vulnerability with risk, they require a slower emotional pace to access that depth. At its core, safety is the bridge between emotional distance and emotional availability for an avoidant person. Without it, they default to protection and withdrawal. With it, they begin to reveal the very attachment that was always present but carefully guarded. Confusion in an avoidant person's behavior is often a sign of internal emotional conflict, not indifference. Because what you are seeing on the outside is usually the result of two opposing forces happening inside them at the same time. One part of them genuinely feels connection, attachment, and emotional pull toward the person they care about. At the same time, another part of them becomes activated by that very closeness and begins to perceive it as something overwhelming, risky, or potentially destabilizing. So instead of a clear linear emotional response, what emerges is inconsistency. From the outside, this can look like mixed signals. One day they may be warm, engaged, and emotionally present, and the next they may become distant, quiet, or difficult to reach. This shift is often interpreted as disinterest or emotional detachment. But in reality, it is frequently the result of an internal struggle between the desire for connection and the need for emotional autonomy. These two needs are not balanced smoothly in avoidant attachment. Instead, they often compete with each other. When the need for connection becomes stronger, the avoidant person may move closer, initiate contact, or show affection in subtle ways. In those moments, their emotional system feels open and engaged. But as soon as the intensity of closeness increases beyond what feels comfortable, the protective system activates. This is when withdrawal begins. They may not even consciously decide to pull away. It often happens automatically as a form of emotional regulation. This push and pull dynamic is what creates confusion for the other person. It can feel unpredictable, as if the emotional tone of the relationship is constantly shifting without warning. However, the key misunderstanding is assuming that these shifts represent a change in feeling. In many cases, the underlying feeling remains stable, but the expression of that feeling changes depending on how safe or overwhelmed they feel in the moment. It is also important to recognize that avoidant individuals are often not fully aware of the intensity of their own internal conflict. They may only experience the discomfort, the urge to distance, or the need to reset emotionally, without clearly identifying that these reactions are connected to closeness itself. As a result, their behavior can appear inconsistent even to themselves. This internal conflict creates a cycle. Closeness activates attachment. Attachment activates discomfort. Discomfort triggers withdrawal, and distance eventually restores enough calm for connection to feel possible again. This cycle repeats, not because they are playing games or lacking interest, but because their system is trying to manage emotional intensity in the only way it knows how. So when someone looks confused, inconsistent, or hard to read in an avoidant pattern, it is often not a reflection of emotional absence. It is a reflection of emotional tension between wanting connection and fearing the vulnerability that comes with it. Real connection with an avoidant requires patience, boundaries, and emotional clarity because the dynamic is not driven by lack of feeling, but by how safely those feelings can be experienced and sustained. When someone has an avoidant attachment style, closeness does not automatically translate into stability. In fact, too much intensity too quickly can activate their instinct to withdraw, even when they genuinely care. So the way connection is built has to respect their internal rhythm rather than force emotional acceleration. Patience is essential because avoidant attachment systems often take longer to trust emotional consistency. They may test distance, pull back when things feel too close, or temporarily reduce communication to regulate their internal state. If the response to this behavior is pressure, urgency, or emotional escalation, it can reinforce their need to retreat. Patience, on the other hand, creates space for them to return on their own terms. It communicates that connection is not dependent on constant emotional performance, which helps lower their internal sense of threat. Boundaries are equally important, not as a way to control the avoidant person, but as a way to protect emotional balance in the relationship. Without boundaries, the dynamic can easily become unstable, one person chasing closeness while the other seeks distance. Clear boundaries communicate self-respect and emotional stability. They also prevent resentment from building, which is often what eventually destroys connection in avoidant relationships. A healthy boundary signals, I care about you, but I also care about my emotional needs. Emotional clarity is the third pillar because avoidant dynamics thrive in ambiguity. When communication is unclear, emotionally charged, or inconsistent, it increases anxiety on both sides. The avoidant person may withdraw further, while the other person may become more emotionally reactive. Emotional clarity means being honest about needs without pressure, expressing feelings without escalation, and avoiding indirect communication that creates confusion. It allows both people to understand where they stand without forcing emotional intensity. When these three elements work together, something important happens. The avoidant person begins to experience connection without feeling overwhelmed by it. Instead of associating closeness with loss of control, they begin to associate it with stability and predictability. This does not change their attachment style overnight, but it creates conditions where secure behavior becomes more possible over time. However, it is also important to understand that patience, boundaries, and clarity do not guarantee that an avoidant person will become fully consistent or emotionally expressive in the way someone might expect. What they do create is a healthier emotional environment where connection can exist without constant tension. And in some cases, that is what allows real attachment to deepen rather than collapse under pressure. Ultimately, real connection with an avoidant is not about chasing emotional certainty. It is about building emotional safety through steady behavior, clear communication, and respect for both closeness and space.